Moi. Last video I talked about different verb types within the Finnish language and gave an overview of what could be possibly like the first 5 verbs per type that you'd learn in a total of 30 verbs that you could take as a reference for your own self-study. And so this video I actually want to give an overview, so still not an in-depth analysis of how to conjugate each verb type within each mood and tenses, but I want to cover the different moods and tenses within the Finnish language. And so the goal is just to form an overall picture of what the verbs look like in Finnish. And so to do this I will actually take focus on the active tenses and moods. These are tenses and moods that have a subject to it or an actor, someone executing that verb. And I won't be giving too many examples of how exactly to conjugate each of these tenses and moods, but I will be giving examples that will be mainly on the third person singular. So today's selected sources or references for making this video are verbix.com. It's an online conjugator that you can use to basically throw any verb in there and you'll be able to conjugate them. And actually there seems to be also a noun conjugator in there as well. But just keep in mind that this verb conjugator is very rule-based. So if you throw in there a fake verb that looks like a verb within any of the verb types in Finnish language, it will actually conjugate it for you even though it's not a real word. And actually that might be taken as a testament to the fact that Finnish language is well structured enough that you can just use the rules to conjugate the verbs with minimum account for exceptions. The other resource is Random Finnish Lesson blog that I think is quite alright, and I used it in particular for these past tenses that I needed to check and cross-check. In general, verbs in any language are words that are representing a change in the state of the system. For instance, an apple. I eat an apple, the apple goes from being non-eaten to being eaten. And I guess an important subcategorization of verb moods and tenses is between the active voice and the passive voice. The active voice is a conjugation of a verb where it is explicit that there is an agent, even though you might not name exactly who it is, but there's an agent that executes the action. While in the passive form, you are putting more emphasis on the fact that the object changed state, even though you don't reference what happened, or you don't reference who was executing that change. So for example, hän syö omena means he eats an apple, and it is explicit who is performing the action. You say he, but even though you don't name him. And then for the passive form, one example could be omena syödään. The apple is eaten, so you are putting emphasis on the apple and on the fact that it is changing its state from non-eaten to eaten, but you don't mention who is doing it. And this is particularly important, I guess, for cases where for instance, the apple falls from the tree, where it's a natural event, where there's no agent, it's just a change of state that is intrinsic to that system. Even though you could always form some kind of sentence where you mention that nature made the apple fall, or that physics made the apple fall, and use those as agents in the sentence, you could still do that. But besides active and passive voice, there are 2 other important forms of verb conjugation, and those are the infinitives, which in Finnish there are actually 5 of them. You know, one of them is being just the neutral form of the verb, like for instance syödä, which means to eat. In this form, the verb does not imply that a change has happened or that it will happen at any time. It's just in its neutral form, if you will. And the other infinitives are like states of the verb when it is in a sentence. It doesn't affect the object directly. One example could be malaaminen, which represents the action of painting itself, and it's a type of verb that you'd use, for instance, if you're talking about that painting is hard or painting is time-consuming, and it's a noun effectively. And then there are participles. There are 5 of them in Finnish, and so if infinitives are like a nounification of the verbs, then participles are like an adjectification of the verb. An example of this could be syövä poika, the boy that eats. So you're referring to the boy as having this property that is eating right now, and that is a sort of adjectival form. So the active and passive voice, as I say, I think it's a very important thing for students to or someone interested in learning Finnish to go ahead and study in more detail and go after that. But the infinitives and the participles, I would say that it's perhaps a more advanced topic that the beginners won't necessarily take much benefit of diving into much detail. I would still recommend looking at it and seeing what it is and what are the 5 different infinitives and the 5 different participles, but perhaps it's not too worth it in going into much detail into those. So within the Finnish language there are 4 moods overall. The indicative, which contains the tenses that you're probably familiar with, like the present, the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect or pluquamperfect. And actually these last 3 are forms of past tenses, things that happened in the past or that started happening in the past. Besides the indicative, there is the potential, the conditional, and the imperative. And actually in the Finnish language there is no future tense. Usually future is expressed in other ways, making use of other mechanisms. I guess the simplest one could be, for example, Huomenna hän menee torille, which means tomorrow he goes to the square market. And in this in the sentence you can see that you say the time, which is tomorrow, and then you use the present tense to say what will happen. So moving on with the indicative tenses. So starting with the present, it's basic gateway door for you to start learning verb conjugation in any language. And it's the verb form where you talk about something happening in the present. One example could be hän puhuu paljon, so he speaks a lot. And I guess present can be used to talk about things in the present, but as we saw before with that future example, it can also be used to talk about future and even about things that might happen in a specific circumstance where you specify the time domain under which those things will happen. Then there are the past tenses, the imperfect, perfect, and the pluperfect. So the imperfect is just a pure past. So something happened in the past and it finished happening in the past as well. One example could be hän soi leipää aamupalalla. So he ate bread at breakfast. He ate in the past, he's not eating anymore, and it's clear that it is so. Now the perfect is a little bit more tricky. Generally speaking, it's supposed to be something that started in the past, but it's not necessarily clear that it has ended, or it might be still ongoing. One example could be this, hän on asunut Suomessa 3 kuukautta. So this means he has lived in Finland for 3 months, but just like in the English form, it's not clear that if he's continuing to live or if he has moved. Another way of saying it could be hän on asunut Suomessa 3 kuukauden ajan. So this kind of, they both kind of mean the same thing, and it's dependent upon the context whether you are referring to something that is still ongoing or not. Perhaps, for instance, if someone asks you, so for how long have you lived in Finland? Then you'd answer, mä olen asunut Suomessa 1 vuosi, for example, 1 year. This could be also another example, and in that context it's clear that it's still an ongoing process. And so, yeah, it can also be used to express future when you want to talk about an action relative to some other event that hasn't yet taken place. For example, mä tulen kun hän on maksanut. So I will come when he has paid. So you're waiting for someone to pay and then you'll go one day. So it's almost like a conditional case where an event will happen in the future when some other event happens. So next up is the pluperfect. This is similar to the last case where we're using the perfect for relating two events that are somehow related to each other in time. But in this case, both of those events are over. They happen both in the past. So for example, hän oli syönyt 3 omenaa kun mä tulin. So I'm looking at my notes down here, so probably you have noticed, but so that would mean he had eaten 3 apples when I came. And so when I came is in the past and is finished, and he had eaten 3 apples by then, which is also finished. Besides the indicative, the Finnish has other 3 moods for conjugating verbs. So these are the potential, the conditional, and the imperative. And each of them has the present form and the perfect tense, which is like the past tense as well. And so starting with the potential, the potential is an expression of probability. So you're unsure of how of the event is actually going to take place or took place. And so, for example, hän palannee tänään. He probably plays today. And so this is something that you'd hear, I guess, more on the news. It's not something that Finnish people actually use on day-to-day speaking. Finnish people will usually choose some other form of speaking. Keep in mind that I'm excluding puhekieli or spoken form from these examples that I'm giving you, so it's still kind of in book form. But still, the potential is used more in government communications and situations like that. An example of how Finnish people could, instead of using the potential, could just use another word to signify uncertainty. Could be, for instance, hän varmaan palaa tänään. So he must or will play today. So even though the varmaan is actually like a very sure word, which means must, it actually is in the sentence in a similar way that it would be in English, or when you say he must play today, as in from all of the evidences that you have, he will probably play today. Maybe the player got injured. So then the potential perfect, which is the past form, is very similar. Could be, for instance, hän lienee palannut eilen. So he probably played yesterday. And this makes use of this liene word, which is actually a form of conjugation of the verb olla, but it's actually a word that comes from the past history of the Finnish language, and is based on a verb that is not existing in the language today anymore, but it is used in this kind of in a certain context within verb conjugation, and it's a part of the list of conjugations of the verb olla. So if you look at the table of conjugation of olla, you'll find it there under the potential perfect. Then moving on to the conditional. So the conditional is pretty much like English. There's not much here to say, and it's quite used during the day, and it's like a friendly, polite way of communicating to other people. So for instance, hän haluaisi suklaajätelöä. So this is like he would like chocolate ice cream. So if you're at a restaurant and the waiter comes to you, he'll probably use the conditional to ask you what would you like. The conditional perfect is pretty much the same thing but in the past. So for example, hän olisi halunnut suklaajätelöä. So he would have liked chocolate ice cream. So you're not sure, but you're expressing the sense that the event could have happened in the past given certain conditions. Okay, so moving on to the imperative. It's a very important form of conjugation, and you probably are familiar with it already because it's early in the studies. If you're studying Finnish, at least to, I don't know, 3 chapters within the Suomen study, something like that. And this is, the imperative is used to give commands to someone. For example, tule, come, which is what you'd use, for instance, if you're calling your dog or if you're calling your friend, let's go. And a negative form could be älä juo tuota, don't drink that. Yeah, but so in Finnish the imperative has other persons as well besides the first person, or sorry, besides the second person. Actually the first person is not, doesn't exist. You don't direct yourself. Usually if you're going to give commands to yourself, I don't know, if you're talking to yourself, you're going to talk in the second person. And the other persons are usually derived from the third person, which could be, for instance, hän puhukoon, which sounds very biblical in a way. So he shall speak. And it's not used in common day language, pretty much like in English. It's more used for like this poetic form, and there's a general rule. It's for directing someone who is not present in the room. So you're giving an order for someone who's not here, and it also has other persons, like actually the first and second and third persons in the plural, besides having the second and third person. Okay, so the imperative perfect. This is only the third person exists, plural and singular, and it sounds something like hän olkoon puhunut. He shall have spoken, even more biblical and less useful for common day language, but now you know about it. Alright, so we have now covered pretty much all of the moods and tenses of the Finnish language, and with this now you have an overview of the Finnish verbs, and you should be quite the pro at it. So now the job is to go back and look at all of the different verb types that I talked about in the last video and see how to conjugate them in these different moods and tenses. And of course you'll have to choose which things you study, so you can focus perhaps on the most important things like the present and the imperfect, which are the two most important tenses to know to have an effective speech, and perhaps also the imperative and a few others that are also quite important. And look at how they are conjugated. You can write down the verbs and conjugate them and do that exercise until you are familiar with those forms, and your brain starts to have an intuition for how to conjugate the verbs and put in words what you want to say. Keep in mind that these verbs and that these tenses and moods have conjugation forms not only in the positive, which I have used in most of the examples, but also in the negative. I used in the example of the imperative ala iwo tuota, and in general each mood and tense will have a different way of conjugating the negative form, so you'll have to look into that. But of course there's a lot of cross correlation between positive and negative forms, but there might be other details, like for instance negative form is usually used with the partitive form of the object in the sentence. And then besides the positive and the negative, there's also the question form, and the question form is how you would conjugate the verb within the context of the question, and that might bring a few more details of how to conjugate things. Yeah, alright, so I hope this was useful to you. Let me know in the comments what you think. Before we go, I'd like to thank my friend Otto, who has helped me a lot. He's actually a great friend, and he's pretty good with Finnish grammar, which I think it's not very common for natives of a specific language to know their own grammar. And he has helped me correct this and make sure that everything is more or less in place, but of course I'll probably make mistakes, especially with accents, yeah. But anyway, this is all. I hope that you enjoyed, and see you next time.